Good morning, fourth grade. I hope that you are enjoying the last holiday concert. I cannot wait to hear what happens next. Today we are only reading one chapter, and it is chapter 9, titled Detention. Palmer Intermediate, Miss Hood speaking. Will you please hold a moment? It was a little before 3 o'clock. The hallways had gotten quiet, but the office was still jumping. Moms and dads had come to drop off notes or pick up kids, and a steady stream of teachers rushed in and out. The nurse went bustling through with a girl who had skinned her knee, and the school secretary was trying to help everyone while she juggled 3 phone calls. Hart trudged up to the counter and waited. Putting one hand over the telephone mouthpiece, the secretary raised her eyebrows. Yes? Hart whispered, I'm here for detention. Miss Hood shook her head. Talk louder, dear. Detention, said Hart, his face turning pink. I have to serve a detention. She pushed a clipboard and a pen toward him. After Hart had written his name and the time, Miss Hood pointed toward the bench with one long red fingernail. Hart sat down and dug a novel out of his backpack, flipped it open to his bookmark, leaned against the wall, and began to read. The noisy office and the school with all its clocks disappeared. The moment Carson knew something was wrong, it was already too late. First came a muffled explosion, then the screech of tires. The small car bucked and shuddered as he fought to get it back under control. The left fender scraped the tunnel wall and sparks splashed against the windshield, almost blinding him. Too fast, too fast. But the brake pedal had turned to mush. Carson struggled against the steering wheel, struggled to keep the car from veering into an oncoming truck. It was no use. It was as if a giant hand had taken a hold of. Well, it's Mr. Evans. Hart looked up from his book and blinked. Mr. Minyard stood there in front of him, smiling. You seem very relaxed. I thought I'd find you madly preparing for your big concert. With so much responsibility hanging over my head, I usually get pretty anxious, all tied up in knots. But this year, I think I'm going to really enjoy the holidays. Mr. Minyard turned away and walked over to a wall of teacher mailboxes. He pulled a stack of papers out of his cubbyhole. As he rifled through them, he began humming Frosty the Snowman. Hart tried to get back into his book, but Mr. Minyard's humming was distracting, annoying too. And the guy was taking his time at the mailboxes, looking carefully over every piece of mail, every memo, every note. Finally, the music teacher turned to go, and as he started out the door, he smiled at Hart and said, I'm looking forward to chorus tomorrow. It was the combination of the smile and Mr. Minyard's tone of voice. It reminded Hart of his sister Sarah, and that little comment made him feel like he'd been poked in the ribs. Hart suddenly felt brave, which can be dangerous for a kid serving detention in the office. He smiled back at Mr. Minyard and said, Chorus? Oh, you mean free period. I'm looking forward to free period too. Mr. Minyard stopped. He came over and stood in front of Hart. That free period business? That's not a good idea, Hart. Still feeling much too brave, Hart said, well, me, being the course director, that's not a good idea either. Someone else should do it. Hart paused a second and then said, you should do it. You're the real director. Mr. Minyard suddenly liked the way this conversation was going. He said, how about this? If you can convince the class tomorrow that I should be in charge again, then we'll get back to work. Just tell everybody that the job is too big for a kid to handle. That should do it. Of course, they might still want course to be a free period, but that's your problem. Fair enough? Hart nodded. Sure. It sounded like an easy way out. He said, that's what I'll do. All right then, said Mr. Minyard. See you tomorrow. And he left the office. As Mr. Minyard walked away, Hart could hear him whistling a melody. Deck the halls with boughs of holly, fa la 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 la. Hart felt relieved, but not quite as jolly as Mr. Minyard did. Hart still had plenty of detention left. He tucked his book away, rested his elbows on his knees, and put his chin in his hands. He sat there looking down at the green and brown speckles of the office carpet, thinking and thinking. And the more he thought, the more he liked the idea of Mr. Minyard taking charge of the concert again. Any other solution would just lead to trouble, probably more detentions too. But the feeling that he'd been poked in the ribs wouldn't go away. It almost felt like Mr. Minyard had tricked him. But how? Hart couldn't find out. The idea that everything would just go back to normal in chorus, that part of the deal seemed fine. Better than fine. Wonderful. Hart knew he did not want to be in charge of this concert, or any concert, ever. No way. He wanted to hide in the back row of the chorus and mumble through the songs like he always did. And all he had to do was stand up in class tomorrow and tell everyone that organizing the concert was impossible, and then ask Mr. Minyard to take charge again. Not so bad. He could do that, and he knew he could get the class to go along too. But something still didn't feel quite right to Hart. His thoughts went round and round. Thinking back to the class period, Hart remembered what had happened after he said Colleen or Ross should be the director. Mr. Minyard had said, "They weren't elected. You were." Hart thought about that, about being elected. He had been elected, and without asking anybody for a single vote. How come the kids elected me? Because I'm popular, that's how. Hart had always known that he was pretty popular, but this election, that proved it, and that made him feel good. Then Hart thought, but it was also sort of a joke. Everyone thought it would be funny if I was the chorus director, especially after that rubber band business. They thought it would be funny. Hart smiled and nodded. It was funny. Then Hart sat up straight on the bench in the office, sat up so fast that he almost banged his head against the wall. Mr. Minyard, he thinks it's funny too. Me being the director and me standing up tomorrow and saying I can't do it, he thinks that'll be the funniest part of all. I'm squirming and he's having a blast. He's going to be laughing the whole time. Hart sat on the bench, staring straight ahead, nodding slowly, his eyes bright. The look on his face was so intense that when Miss Hood glanced at him, she stood up and said, "Hart, are you all right?" Surprised, Hart looked at her blankly for a second. "Me?" he asked. Mrs. Hood said, "Yes, are you okay?" Hart nodded, and with a crooked little smile, he said, "I'm just fine."